You'll probably laugh or say fake, but while working as a landscaper in my early 20s, I saw something completely bizarre in an old colonial cemetery. It was noon, and I stopped for lunch. There was some shade against a stone wall at the back of the cemetery, so that's where I sat down. I heard something behind me, and I turned to look over the wall. It was only 3 or 4 feet tall, but very old and more of a long pile than a proper wall. A few yards past the wall, there was a goat, just standing there looking at me. It was weird right off the bat because this old cemetery wasn't near any farms or anything. It was in the middle of the woods. Besides that, the goat itself was unnerving. He had black fur, 4 horns, and milky white eyes. Okay, so far, not too bizarre, but it also had some kind of black goo dripping from its body. Like chocolate syrup. Strange, yes, but I wasn't actually afraid until it stood up on its hind legs and bellowed like a cow. It's funny now, but my reaction was to throw my Coke at it and run to my car. When I got to the driver's side door, I looked back. The goat was still standing there, reared up on its hind legs. He bellowed again. I flew down that dirt road like I was going for a record. All these years later, I still get the creeps going to cemeteries or graveyards. Other than the occasional funeral, I rarely need to. I won't be going to that one for any reason. Bet on that.
Florida summer camp has so many shadow people. What are these things and why are they all here? So I just spent the summer out in the middle of nowhere in Florida, USA, working at a summer sleepaway camp. This camp owns over 100 acres of pure forest, and before it was a camp it was an air base. So for quite a few years now, maybe much longer. But I'm only going to discuss stories I received right from the source. Counselors and campers alike have been having weird experiences out there with tall shadow people. And normally there's a lot of fun storytelling at camps, but there is an eerie amount of correlation between some of these stories I've heard about this specific thing. And some of these people who have had these experiences don't know the stories from the others. They all describe the same thing. Tall, thin, shadowy figures of men, sometimes one, sometimes multiple. Their heads are apparently quite a bit taller than the top bunks in the cabins, which is a good 8 feet at least. Campers have described them as having to duck to get through the doorway. Twice in the past couple years, an entire cabin has seen these things. Usually the counselors would think the kids were trying to mess with them, but because of the sheer amount of these similar reported experiences from campers, it's being taken more seriously. I feel like something weird is going on, especially when multiple 13-year-old boys are crying because they're so freaked out. On one of these occasions, the campers said these shadow figures came into the cabin and pushed their bunks around. The next morning, marks were left on the floor where the bunks had been moved. On a different occasion, only one figure came in and just stood facing the corner, and the entire cabin witnessed this. On multiple occasions, only one camper has seen this figure, and it has only stared at them from the middle of the room. What on earth is going on out here? What is this thing? I myself have not had any strange experiences all summer except for one. I was in the cabin on the counselor's side about to take a nap, but was not asleep yet, just recently laid down. I was on my side facing the wall. There was nobody else in the cabin. Twice within the 45 minutes I was there, something sat on the bed behind me, so the cheap mattress sagged like it would if a person sat down, and I rolled a little. Of course, when I turn around, nothing's there. I'm not sure if that's related to the shadow figures stories though.
True ghost story. Scary encounter turned my skeptic mother into a believer. Experience. Before any of this happened, my mom never believed in ghosts. Not so much that people stopped existing after death, as she still believes in heaven, but she didn't think the souls would stick around or get stuck with us. I believed and still do believe in ghosts, which she thought was weird until about a year ago. I had moved back in with my mom after college while waiting to get an apartment of my own. Her house, which she bought the year before, isn't that old. It's small and serves as a nice place to live after she retired. As far as we knew, the previous resident had died while in a nursing home, not on the property, though there might have been a previous resident since we occasionally got mail for the same guy. We'll come back to him later. So here's what happened. It's late at night, and I'm getting ready for bed. Hair and rollers, clay mask on, putting body moisturizer on my arms while listening to my music on speaker. Mom's already in bed, and her bedroom is on the other side of the house. Just as I'm halfway through my routine, I hear her yell my name. And it wasn't in the way that parents yell when you're in trouble or need you to put away the groceries. It sounded like something big happened. I think it's her old dog using the bedroom as a bathroom again, so I head over. When I walk in, my mom's white as a sheet, looking around like she's looking for something. I ask her what's up, and she is freaked out, saying that a man was in her room. I'm weirded out, since no one could get into her room. She goes on to say that she was lying in bed, waiting to fall asleep, when she looked over and saw a man coming towards her from her bathroom, hands stretched out to her. Described it like the drawing of the evil uncle from Twitches. She bolted up out of fear or to scream for help because he looked so real, only for him to just not be there when she moved. I joked that she had a ghost in her room, and she told me not to say that because she was thinking the same thing, but didn't want it to be true. My mom got up and was pacing around in the room for a bit, and tried to go back to sleep with light on, but ended up sleeping on her recliner that night. She did go back to sleeping in her room after that night, but only for a couple nights before she had a flight across the country to visit my siblings. I agreed to sleep in her room since that's where her pet's kennels are, and joked that I would tell her if I ran into the ghost. Kinda mean on my part, since the experience really shook my mom, but it felt kinda funny how serious she got and insisted it was a ghost after not believing in them before. However, my first night, something just felt wrong when I turned off the lights and settled into the bed. I felt a sense of impending dread while laying there, and something told me not to fall asleep. It was so creepy, and despite no logical reason to be, I was scared to go to sleep in my mom's room. Like something was waiting for me the second I lost consciousness, and I was the stupid character who was walking around the haunted house while the ghost got closer. Too spooked to go to sleep, I turned on the light and grabbed some sage and moon-charged crystals I have in my room, burning them around the bedroom and her bathroom doorways. Then I texted my mom and told her yep, her room is haunted and that something was scaring me from going to sleep. She was not happy to hear that I got spooked as well and needed crystals, sage, and the lights on to sleep. So right before she came home, my mom did a lot of research and got crystals and a cross that were supposed to help filter out strong negative energy. She brought it home, replaced my protection stuff with hers, and even made a proclamation her first night back in her room that this was her home, and if the spirit was going to scare or hurt her again, he was not welcomed and had to leave. Thankfully, it seemed that all have worked, as she hasn't had an experience like that again. So who was this spirit? We honestly don't know. I suspect it was D, since he was the first resident and might have come back if he died, but we don't know if he is actually dead, so it may not be him. Another explanation is that the spirit was invited in a few weeks prior, when my mom was super sick. It wasn't COVID or something that needed the hospital, but she couldn't leave her room for over a week and only got better after about 10 days. We read that sometimes being super sick can attract negative spiritual attention, and since she was stuck in her room for the time, it might have settled there instead of another part of or the whole house. But since then, my mom still affirms that something tried to grab her that night, and hasn't moved her protection since.
Someone snaps their fingers outside my window every night at 3 a.m. The neighbors warned me not to look at him. I heard it my first night in the new house, someone walking down the street and snapping their fingers with both hands in the middle of the night. Shit, I had forgotten to close my curtains. Earlier that day, an older couple came over with a saran-wrapped plate of muffins and a warning. They told me that every night at 3 a.m. someone walks outside the house and snaps his fingers. They said that I should never, under any circumstances, look at the man. If I did, I would sorely regret it. When I asked them what happened if you looked at him, they didn't say a word. Instead, they just looked at each other, and the husband shook his head. Now I was in my room and the snapping man was on his way. I was just about to get out of bed and shut the curtains when suddenly the next snap came from right outside the bedroom window. I let out a startled cry. The house was a good 20 feet from the public sidewalk and separated by a garden gate and then a row of bushes. Somehow he had cleared that distance in less than a second. I covered my face with the pillow and curled up into a ball. A whispered prayer escaped my lips, and I hoped that God was stronger than whatever was outside. The thing started walking back and forth, going just past my house each time. His snapping started out slow and rhythmic but got faster and faster each time until it reached a feverish speed. As they sped up, the snaps grew louder, much louder than any sound a human snap could make, to the point that they rattled the window glass in its pain and drowned out every other sound. I began to shake and shouted for Jesus to protect me. Part of me wanted desperately to jump out of bed and face whatever monster was outside. But I thought back to my neighbor's visit and resisted the urge. It wasn't even their warning that persuaded me. It was the look on their faces when I asked what happened to those who chose to look. They both turned white as ghosts, like the blood had been drained from their heads, and their faces twisted in nauseating fear at the memory of neighbors who hadn't heeded their warnings. It was the kind of instant animal reaction that you cannot hide even when you try. So I knew that whatever happened to those who looked, it had to be terrifying. Even so, it was difficult to lie there defenseless in bed while the snaps grew so loud that I thought my eardrums might burst. I tried stuffing the corners of my pillow down my ears, but it did nothing to quiet the incessant roar. Then there was silence. The noise stopped so suddenly that it was almost startling. From outside, a gravely reptilian voice said, Not in a whisper but in a low and quiet tone. "Good night." Footsteps went away from the window and back up the road in the direction they came. It wasn't until the footsteps trailed off that I noticed the sound of someone crying. After a moment, I realized it was me. I was crying. No. Sobbing uncontrollably. The experience had been absolutely terrible and frightening in a way I cannot put into words. The worst part was that the louder the snaps got, the more I wanted to look at who was doing them. It wasn't just a morbid curiosity. It was almost as if the sound was beckoning me, like an audible anglerfish was inviting me into its razor-filled jaws. I got up without opening my eyes and shut the window curtains. It took 4 more hours to fall asleep. And even then only because the sun was starting to rise and the world felt safe again. After a while I developed certain strategies for coping with my nightly visitor. At first I tried putting earplugs in before going to bed. But that didn't do anything to cover up the sound of the snapping. Worse still, the goodbye at the end was always as clear as if I had my ear up against the wall. I asked around, and some people in the neighborhood let me know that you could help drown out the noise by leaving a fan on through the night. It sounded dumb at first, but I was desperate enough to try anything at that point, and sure enough, it worked. The snapping was still loud, but endurable. And after a week I was sleeping through the whole thing, in order to make sure I never accidentally looked out the window. I tied the curtains shut and put a box over the sill for an added layer of protection. I also constructed a wall of cardboard around the corner of my bed closest to the window, so that if I happened to look over there in the middle of the night and the box had in some way fallen off and the curtains were somehow open, I still wouldn't see him. I even put tripwire in front of the window so that if I were to try and unblock the window in my sleep I would fall over and wake up. I know, it's a lot of precautionary stuff. But what would you do in my situation? I was determined to not be like one of those dumbasses in scary movies who know there's an imminent threat and just keeps going about things as usual. And when the monster gets them, everyone in the audience thinks I told you so. Fuck that. Once I fine-tuned my nighttime defense strategies, my life started getting back to normal. I joined a book club, settled into my new job, and even became friends with a couple coworkers. One was a goofy guy named Tyler who's stupid in a fun-to-be-around kind of way, and the other was a beautiful girl I was flirting with named Amanda. Everything was going great until I had the dumb idea to invite both of them over for a little party at my place. We started off with board games, pizza, and beer, then more beer, then some pizza, and finally some more beer. At one point Tyler got up to use the pisser as he put it, and I seized the opportunity to capitalize on the liquid courage I had in my system and make a move on Amanda. I was just building up to it when Tyler shouted out, "What the fuck is this stuff in your room?" I froze. I had gone so long without waking up at 3 a.m. that I had half forgotten about the thing that roamed the neighborhood. I looked down at my watch. 2:55. Shit. I had let time get away from me. I got up and ran into my bedroom, and Amanda followed me. "Don't touch it. Get away from the window," I shouted at Tyler, who was peeling back the box on the windowsill. He and Amanda stared at me with their mouths gaping open, and I knew I had to explain myself. I told them all about the thing that comes by every night at 3 a.m. and how it was incredibly dangerous to look at him. I expected them to think I was crazy, but that wasn't exactly how they reacted. "Whoa," Tyler gasped. "So, like, your neighborhood is haunted?" "Well, yeah, I guess technically, but it's not a huge deal as long as you stay away from that window," I said. "So, like, you've never even seen the guy that does this?" he asked me. I shook my head. "How do you know it isn't just some random loser playing a prank?" "Trust me. If you heard it you would know that it isn't anything human," I told him. He looked at me with a flash of excitement. "What time is it?" he asked. I checked my watch again. 2:58. I stuttered, and then looked at him in terror. I did not want them to witness the snapping. For some reason it just felt dangerous to have them around. I worried something unexpected would happen. Something out of my control, like Amanda tripping and accidentally ripping down the box on the window, or Tyler being Tyler and trying to drunk fight the monster. I mean, they were two highly intoxicated young adults, and we were at what shared a passing resemblance to a party. I was basically playing with fire inside a fuel tank. "We need to get out of here. Let's go back into the living room. Come on," I blurted and tried to herd the two out of my room. But Tyler wouldn't budge. "No fucking way, man. Now that we're here, I want to hear this thing. I'm staying." I could tell he meant it, and I didn't know what I could do to convince him to leave. Before I could even think of something else to say, I heard it.
I used to give haunted tours of an old town. Experience. I used to be a tour guide in a popular tourist town in Tennessee. My job at the time was to take people on a circuitous 2-mile walk around the town, telling them the ghost stories of the people who had lived there. During the summer, tours started a little before sundown and would end well after dark. All in all, it would take us roughly 1 or 2 hours to get through a tour, depending on the walking speed of my group. Just to preface this, the vast majority of stories we told were not true. They were either largely exaggerated, entirely fabricated, or simply gruesome stories of local murders with a paranormal twist added at the end with the ghost of the killer still lurking about. I didn't write the script, don't blame me. In fact, I visited a local museum and sourced authentic ghost stories from a curator in order to add a few of my own to the tour which were actually authentic. That said, there were a handful of times during my stint as a tour guide in which I had experiences that were not so easily explained. In this post, I'm going to detail 3 of the most interesting ones. Story 1. One of the tools we got for our tours were EMF detectors, which I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with. They're intended to scan for electromagnetic frequencies, and will detect the relative strength of a signal they pick up. Now, just because one of these things goes off doesn't mean you're seeing a ghost. They also pick up power lines and will go off like crazy near a generator, but if you're in the middle of nowhere and you suddenly get a strong signal, it's worth looking into. Now these detectors we used had about 5 lights on them, changing in hue from green to yellow to red. Red meant no signal, and green indicates a strong signal. The light never goes below red unless you turn the thing off. That's the baseline. At the end of our tour, we would come to an old graveyard. After I did my thing with the final story, people would wander around and look at the graves with flashlights, and scare themselves shitless. But one night as they were wandering, a man called me over to see one of the graves. I went over and had a look, and saw what the problem was. Whenever he passed his EMF detector over this particular grave, all the lights would turn off. The entire machine would turn itself off when it was over this grave, and turn back on as soon as you moved it away. We tried with a couple other graves, but only this one had the effect. We were curious about the grave, so we tried to read the name of the person, but the headstone was too worn down for us to read it. The first name Thomas was faintly able to be read, but the surname was too hard to read. We had the whole group leaning over it at this point trying to read it, when we all heard the same thing. As one of the group wondered aloud what the man's surname was, a loud voice from behind us shouted Whaley. As you may have guessed, there was nobody behind us when we turned around, and we called the tour to a close shortly after that. I never messed with that specific grave again, except to place some flowers on it one time. Story 2. At the end of the tour, sometimes I would get tips if people had fun, got spooked. Older boomer and Gen X men really enjoy the charade of the covert handshake tip, where they palm you the money as they shake your hand. I always indulged the bit, because hey, I was getting a tip. One tour I ran had a family of 3 and an older man who I initially thought was grandpa, but later learned had been lumped into their group because we didn't run solo tours. The old guy was pretty quiet throughout the tour, but would occasionally ask very pointed questions that stood out to me as odd. I don't remember most of his questions anymore, but one example is that I was telling a story of a girl who fell from a balcony, and her ghost haunts the river she plummeted into to this day, and he asked me if I thought she died right away when she hit the ground, or whether I thought she died slow and suffered. Just weird things like that. Well, at the end of the tour, the family took off into the graves to have a look about, see if ghosts would show up in their pictures, etc. Old man came to give me that typical handshake, and mentally I was thinking that all his weird behavior could be easily forgotten if he tipped well. The handshake was normal except that his hand was ice cold, but old folks have cold hands, so I didn't think about it too much. Except he didn't palm me $1, he palmed me a coin. I thought it was a $50 when I felt it at first, but it was too big. I turned to glance at the guy as he walked past me to leave, and I shit you not, he was just gone. The path leaving the graveyard was downhill and you had visibility from the top for at least 300 feet. There was no way he could have covered that distance in that time, and I didn't even hear running. Just this old, tottering man in front of me 1 second and gone in the blink of an eye when he walked past me. When I got home and looked up the coin, I learned it was a 1 troy ounce silver bullion, minted to an older year. I don't remember exactly. I can check the year when I get home this evening if anyone cares. Overall, the experience left me a little shocked, and the family agreed he was really odd when I walked them back to their car. Apparently, the guy greeted their daughter by name when they arrived at the meetup spot a few minutes before me, but they had no idea who he was. Story 3. So 2 weird experiences, but no ghostly apparitions or demonic screams. Unfortunately, most nights on the ghost tour were entirely mundane. However, I have got one more odd story I experienced which really set my belief of ghosts in stone. One of the earlier stops in our tour was an old cabin where the town's progenitor once lived. The cabin has been moved around a couple of times to build parking garages, but has since been placed back on its original spot. We don't actually have a photo of the woman who founded the town, but we have got pictures of her granddaughter, who everyone at the time swore was a dead ringer for her grandmother. Because of this, an old black and white photo of her granddaughter is on the sign outside the cabin. The cabin is kept locked up with a padlock at all times except when the Historical Society opens it up for school groups. The windows are so dirty you can't see inside, and most of the time it's too dark to get a decent look inside anyway. Regardless, I like to encourage people to peek through the cracks in the old wood because they'd psyche themselves into thinking they saw something move, and a spooky tour is a tour with good tips. Anyway, one night after I did the whole spiel about her founding the town, and how people say they can see her ghost within the cabin on some nights to this day, I let them all have a go at peeking inside. One of the younger teens in the group approached me after looking inside, and we had a very odd conversation. These kids usually think it makes them cool to be skeptical and show everyone they're not scared. So he asked me something like, "Who's in the costume?" I was a little confused and explained how the photo on the sign is a picture of the granddaughter of the town's founder, but that she wasn't wearing a costume. That was how people dressed at the time. The little shit rolled his eyes and told me he meant the woman in the cabin. Of course I had to have a look, so I peeked through, and sure enough, a street light was shining through the dirty windows and letting in a diffuse sort of light, and you could just make out a figure in a rocking chair sitting in the corner of the dark cabin, rocking back and forth. It was hard to get a good look at her, but from what I saw, she did look just like the woman in the photo. I moved the group on pretty fast because quite frankly, I was a little afraid it was a homeless person who'd broken in somehow. If it was, I had a group of 6 kids and 1 parent. I didn't want anybody getting hurt or snatched. But I stopped by the cabin again on the way to my car, and the lock was on tight and undamaged. I peeked inside again, and there wasn't even a rocking chair in the cabin. In the whole time I worked the tour route I never saw a chair in that cabin again, or any old women, for that matter. So anyway, those are my stories. I know they aren't as sensational as some, but I thought I'd share my experiences with you all. I have a few more odd stories that I can share if you like, but they're all more explainable by mundane means, if not still creepy in an odd,